Okay, can you hear me? Yes? Okay, brilliant. It's my great pleasure to introduce the next panel. We have a very distinguished group of people. First of all, Anne Helmreich, who is Director of the Archives of American Art in Washington, and also Lynn Rother, who is Professor of Provenance Studies at Leuphana University and Adjunct Curator for Provenance at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. And they are being moderated by ICRA board member Alex Morrison, who's founder of digital specialist. Is it Cogapp or Cogapp? I know. Yeah. I should know. I'm terrible. Anyways, just a quick word about what the panel will be about. It's going to look at how digital technologies are helping to raise awareness of underrepresented artists and art. And so it's going to explore strategies for making stockbooks, museum records, and other art-related data more visible and accessible. We'll also consider the power of connected knowledge bases like Wikidata and ULAN, while at the same time thinking about how we ensure cultural accuracy and context. And additionally, we'll look at artist-driven philanthropy, very important when it comes to Catalogues Raisonnés, including how the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation is supporting cataloguing and digitization initiatives for historically underrepresented groups in the Archives of American Art. So I'll hand over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, this should be really interesting. I think the conversations so far have been fascinating. I think what we're going to do in this panel is to go into some detail in a way that we haven't before, looking at practice, and particularly technologically based practice, exploring these issues, and in the discussion, I think we can sort of loop back to some of the things that have been raised already in relation to these very, very nitty-gritty practical and coalface kind of operations. So the way it's going to work, so Anne and Lynn have both got reasonably short presentations. Anne will speak first, then Lynn. Then we'll have a conversation between the three of us, then questions from the floor and from the online world. So.
Right. Well, I feel a little nervous because you promised detail, and we've got 30 million objects, so I can't go into detail. But I have sort of 8 points that I want to kind of walk you all through. But any one of these, we could go into more depth. So really, don't hesitate to ask questions later or at the drinks. I'm happy to talk about them. So the Archives of American Art were part of the Smithsonian Institution. And we were founded in 1954, and we were actually founded at the Detroit Institute of Art. And I've actually been thinking a lot about our founding as we've been talking today, because we were founded by 2 men, one of whom was the museum director, and the other person at that time was a businessman art collector, who then goes on to become an art dealer later in his career. And I feel like it's interesting that those 2 individuals at that kind of nexus of collector, museum, and eventual dealer recognize the need to preserve primary sources relating to the history of American art. We joined the Smithsonian in 1970, but our purpose has remained the same since 1954. We are intended to be a trusted source. We want to empower an expansive history of American art and culture. Krista's points about inclusivity resonate very much with us. And we do this by collecting, preserving, and making available to all primary sources documenting the visual arts of the United States. As Alex said, what I'm going to focus on today is that making available bit, but I do want to give a little background on collecting because it really relates to the topic of this underrepresented that we've been talking about. So sorry if I'm going a little astray from the remit, but I wanted to make that connection. Although I will say some people have already made it for me. Of some of the names you've already heard today, we have the papers of Lee Krasner. We have the papers of Alma Thomas. We have the papers of the dealer Macbeth, the dealer Krashauer, and we just heard Andre Emmerich, whose papers we hold as well. When I say papers, we actually, and I'll come back to this a little bit, we collect physical paper, but we also are now collecting born digital. And then we also do oral histories. We have the largest oral history collection devoted to the history of American art. So when I say papers, it's sort of the things you would order up in an archive reading room, but you can also literally order up the oral histories. We do a transcription of every oral history, so even if you can't hear the whole oral history on our website, it would kill our website, because some of these are like 8 to 12 hours long, but you can get the full transcript from our website. So one of the first questions, I've only been in this job 2 years, so one of the first questions I get asked is, well, how do you decide what to collect? And it's like, it's a little squishy, I'll be honest, but literally our criteria is it must have long-term research value for the field.
Fair enough.
So yeah, how do we decide that? I am so grateful for some of the choices that my predecessors made before I arrived. We have an outstanding collection, for example, of women artists. Before many of these women had any kind of market value or even scholarship around them. So, we try to make wise choices, informed choices. I'm going to talk about how we use advisory committees and other things. But long-term research value, we work closely with the field, but that's, it's a challenging remit. We have done periodic assessments asking where do we need to strengthen our efforts that have led to special collecting initiatives. These collecting initiatives are meant to jumpstart something, and then we continue to collect in those areas ongoing. But the jumpstarting means maybe we get special funding to bring together advisory committees or special funding for travel. Things of that nature. So in 2014, we launched, these are our about page. In 2014, we launched our feminist collecting initiative. And from that, we collected the papers, for example, of Joyce Kozloff, the artist, Senga Nagudi. We also collect the papers of art historians. Linda Nauckland's papers came to us under this initiative, Nancy Spiro, other people in the art world. So we continue this work, but 2014 allowed us to do a deep dive. We did some surveys, outreach to the field. In 2015, we launched our Latino collecting initiative in collaboration with the Smithsonian's Latino initiatives. Many of you may know my colleague Josh Franco, who came on board through that effort, and he's brought on some amazing collections, the graffiti artist Chaz Bohenis, Paul Ramirez-Jonas, who's on Krista's board, where Krista's is, the art historian Thomas Ybarra-Frausta. So we've really benefited, again, through those initiatives. In 2018, with special funding from the Luce Foundation, we began our African American Collecting Initiative, and we've reinvigorated that this year with some additional funding. And from that, we collected the papers of Howardina Pindell, Emma Amos, Joyce Scott. And then in 2024, we launched our Asian American Pacific Islander Initiative, and we just acquired the papers of Hung Liu. So those arrived in September. And the funding, for example, helps to our collector, Christina Ason-Plank, travel to places like Hawaii. That wasn't naturally in our travel budget. But again, all of these are ongoing once they've started, but they allow us to do like collections guides and other additional work around that. I should add something, thinking back to your point about monetizing archives. We do not, by and large, buy archives. They're donations. So why would people donate to us? I sometimes tell a family, if financial matters are of paramount to you, I'm happy to refer you to other colleagues. But often why people want to donate to us is what I'm going to talk about next, the work we do of cataloging, of processing, and making available. I think sometimes, too, artists donate to us because they want to reconstruct those communities we were talking about. They know the papers of artist X, who was their friend, is already in the archives. I want to be in that neighborhood again, so to speak. So once papers come in, the next step in their journey is processing, and it refers to organizing the materials that we receive. We have 4 different levels of processing, as you can see on the screen. We try to, within a year, depends on how big the collection is, so don't hold me to this, but within a year, we try to have everything to level 2. Because level 2 means I can make it available to a reader. There's enough information there that I'm not sending you out. I mean, we literally got the papers of Robert Indiana last summer, 150 boxes. I can't bring you 150 boxes if I don't have an inventory, because you're going to be so frustrated. We will do it. We did it. But it's better if we have that level 2, and I can at least direct you to the right box level. So we did that. We made that decision to reduce our backlog so that we don't have things sitting there for years and years while people wait to get their hands on them. The other thing we've done is adopt something called critical cataloging. And I have on the screen an article that my colleague Christina Ason-Plank co-authored with another colleague, Ryoko Oko, about the process of critical cataloging. What this means is we review existing subject terms, we research and update outdated or problematic terms, and we update the records to enhance their visibility and accessibility of collections. So with respect to Asian American, there was a lot of debate about what was Asian America. Was Southeast Asia part of that? So we worked with our colleagues across the Smithsonian to help define. And when it started, we thought we had very few collections. We had very few collections because they weren't properly cataloged or labeled as artists who self-identified as Asian American. So that critical cataloging allows us to go back and retroactively do that work as need be, and we use that practice going forward. We were just talking about another initiative we have at the Smithsonian relevant to what we've been talking about of better identifying women's names. So they're not Mrs. So-and-so, but they have their own identity. In terms of access, we make materials access in their physical presence in our reading room. And I want to add here, if we collect materials, they are eagerly requested. So here's just some stats. Between March 2024 and June 2024, the papers of Beverly Buchanan, an African-American woman sculptor land artist, and Emma Amos, an African-American woman textile and painter, they were amongst the top 10 most frequently requested papers in our reading room. So this is 24, before Emma Amos's big show that's up now. This is before the Beverly Buchanan's big show in Dallas. If we have it, people will request it. But we also access through digitization. And our digitization program began in 2005 with a major gift from the Terra Foundation. And that established a $5 million endowment to develop the infrastructure to digitize papers of, quote, lasting significance to the history of American art. Then, thank you to the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, which you mentioned, they gave us a second gift for a digitization program in 2018, specifically for the digitization of papers of artists who've been historically underrepresented in the narratives of American art. And on the screen, you see Jeff Donaldson. And if you don't know him as a figure, he was not only an artist in his own right, he knew everyone and sort of active in the community. So he did oral histories himself. So making his collection available was not just making his own work available, but of all the friends and people he had in his community. So this is what that gift has made available to the field. Turning to the Catalogues Raisonnés topic, Catalogues Raisonnés do show up in our collections in various ways. As I said, we collect the papers of art historians, so we often have the materials of Catalogues Raisonnés in the files of those art historians. We also end up with what I might think of as alternative models to Catalogues Raisonnés. This is the case of the Frederick Hammersley Foundation. This is a foundation similar to what we heard about before, set up with an intentional sunset date. So they knew they were going to end and dissolve their assets by a certain time period. And they decided in the end that they didn't have the time to create a full Catalogues Raisonnés, but they created a database. And that database was part of the records they donated to us. So rather than a Catalogues Raisonnés in a print form or in true digital form, I think when we say digital, you mean like publishing online. This database does exist in a digital form, but you would have to come through us to access it. We just don't put the database straight up online. Because this is in a born digital format, we're constantly making sure it stays up to date, right? Because as you all know, those ones and zeros naturally deteriorate. So we have to make sure the computer program, it's basically Excel, but that we update it. So we keep an original copy, and then we use what's called an emulation version to make accessible to people, so that if you do some boo-boo in our reading room, you haven't destroyed the database for anybody who comes to use it afterwards. So I just mentioned that as an alternative because that means it's preserved in perpetuity what that foundation knew at that moment that they donated it to us. Now we know as the field moves into digital publishing that we'll be asked to take on more born digital material, meaning content that originated in a digital form. And we recently received another gift from the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation to launch an initiative to explore more fully how we can robustly collect, preserve, and make accessible born digital content. And I want to say a big shout out to our colleagues from the Roy Lichtenstein Foundation, because I think we anticipate this really being a partnership. We will learn together what does it mean to preserve a digital catalog raisonné. Because as you can imagine, as an archive, if things come to us in proprietary formats, how can I make that available, right? So how do I get it in a format that I can make it accessible, I can commit to its long-term preservation and accessibility, because you've heard accessibility is key to us. I don't want to have the thing just sitting in a vault. We want to have the thing out and ready to be used. I heard a promise that we were going to be talking about AI. We have actually not done an AI project yet. I've had people come to us, I will tell you what I said no to. Take all your oral histories of artists and make them into an avatar that could answer, I was like, a big thumbs down. So we were just asked to put together a funding proposal on behalf of the Smithsonian, and we put together a much more reasonable proposal. We have, as I mentioned, the largest oral history collection in the United States devoted to the visual arts. In that is 350 oral histories on the New Deal, the Workers' Progress Administration. These have all been transcribed, but there are so many subtopics inside of that, right? Small towns in America, other names of artists, in that we have transcripts, but they haven't been sort of keyworded or double-checked. So could AI allow us to find connections across those oral histories? Oh my gosh, those 5 people were in that town at the same time, but maybe they weren't all working on the same mural. Maybe somebody was looking at, the craft projects. So we're hoping that AI can open up. And back to the flip side, right? One of the reasons we're all nervous about AI is, where did you get that data from? What source did you scrape it from unethically? And the idea is, because we already have transcripts for these oral histories, could we recreate a sort of core set of data that we feel authentic, ethical, responsible, because we've trained it against data that we hold the transcripts for, if that makes sense. So I'm going to stop there. Any one of these we could do a deep dive on, but I'm actually anxious to hear what Lynn has to say. So, but anyway, happy to. Shall I baton pass, or do you want to jump in, Alex?
I think let's go to Lynn, and then we'll get it all together.
Thank
you, Anne. That was great.
Anne.
Really amazing. Yeah.
And also the good handover to the AI, and also, yes, thank you for having me here as a speaker among these esteemed colleagues in the panels, but also in the audience. As a provenance scholar, yes, I will be also talking about AI. It's not a given to be in the Catalogues Raisonnés or in the art history realm, because provenance has a complicated relationship in art history, to say the least. I've called it uncanny at some point, or also piecemeal. Just look at the space that's dedicated to published references, exhibition histories, and legacy Catalogues Raisonnés, and then the space for provenance, 2 lines at last. While actually, it's like people have been murdered. There have been very complicated transactions with multiple agents involved, which of course has changed. And also because, for political reasons, money has been invested in provenance research, so it really has become a more professional field. And I am, now having worked on provenance since 2008, when it was really, I think, worth mentioning, it was only women at the time. There was like 5 in the US, 20 in Germany, 5 in Austria. And it wasn't a career, it wasn't a path that now I then moved to the Museum of Modern Art in New York from working first at building museums, and then having now a full professorship that the Volkswagen Foundation generously funded is something that I don't think I could have imagined in 2008. And part of why
I moved away is because, and so I'm echoing a lot what was said earlier, also Griselda Pollack's remark on really looking at provenances is social art history. And I think art history can also learn from Arjun Apatorai and Igor Kapikov's concept of social life of things, how regime values are really embedded in these provenances. And I brought one, given the timing, about it's in New York's gift to Madame X. I mean, the first line of that very provenance at the National Gallery of Art of this painting shows the problems that are even more problematic when we are making from these text data. And to echo a bit what Douglas said, I would say Catalogues Raisonnés have incredibly valuable provenance knowledge, but poor data, because the way we've been recording provenance is impossible to analyze on a large scale. But because I felt, having worked on provenances over and over again, we create so much knowledge, and museums that have 100,000 of objects all have provenance in a free text field, but they can't answer what of the artworks were in Paris in 1928. You can search for Paris, which is the string, but to have the meaning where the artwork was in Paris and when, you need structured machine-readable data. And that's sort of what drove me to leave New York, heartbroken that I leave this city behind me, but now I'm back and forth, but then to go to a city near Lüneburg and start this, near Hamburg, which is Lüneburg, and start this lab. And now I'm fortunate to work with data scientists, and in February, I think 5 postdoctoral researchers, and I'm also trying to bring this back to MoMA. So because I think provenance is so complicated to analyze, but it's also so fascinating because it brings real world, again, echoing what was said earlier, and the mechanisms of why have, especially if we treat it more holistically and include exhibition history, etc. So what were the people who drove artist work? I'm trying, because we were asked to talk about computational ways, I'm trying to bring it as one of my wonderful postdocs, Barbara Romero Ferran, would say, she calls it family-friendly coding. So I'm trying family-friendly, talking about what also matters. Are we going forward? Yes, but you are not seeing the highlights, because this, are you seeing that I have highlighted periods in this slide? So then just try to find some periods in this provenance, because the important thing is provenance, and now American museums have been at the forefront of publishing them online. And thanks to Nancy Eide, so at a time as early as 2001, there has been a format proposed. Formats that are, for example, like this provenance at the National Gallery of Art in Washington, which means it's in a chronological order. The current owner is the last provenance, but then we have these marks, for example, period, that separate the individual events. Or if it is a direct transfer and not a knowledge gap where we don't know what happened, it is a semicolon. So this means we can divide this into the events. For computers, you need to train the computer to understand when is a period splitting an event and when is the period just an abbreviation of junior, JR. So you need very complex system to do that on a large scale, and that's what we started to do successfully. But the second part is we don't only want individual events that we analyze, we also want to understand what is in the event, what happened, and what is the meaning of it. So we also need to train computational models, and also here you don't see, but provenance consists of people, of time, of date, parties who did things, they received, they gave, all of this. So what we did, and this is where we are not relying on, or so far all tests we've made with large language models, which is the new approachable tech, actually, we have not been successful. What we have been doing for the last 3 years, and where we had received major scores, is we train our own models on a set of given provenances to then structure a much larger amount. And as you see in this, like sold August 15, 1955 to Elsa Mellon Bruce, and then it's her birth dates, 1901 to 1969 in New York, we trained the computer to understand 1901 is her birth year, but 1955 is when the artwork changed hands. So the two complicated, and without going into details, tasks that we identified of the many options of so-called natural language processing, the one is sentence boundary disambiguation, and the other one is span categorization. The devil's in the detail, but I want to share with you, because I'm also hoping in every one of you who's writing provenances, why it is so important to be consistent and to be respectful for the marks that you are using. If you use parentheses, always use them in the same way. If you use brackets, use them, these kind of differentiations. Because then you can turn any text into analyzable data. And this is where we made only in the last years and started to publish on it some insights. And the one is, and I'm showing this very simple bar chart, I called it now gender generosity. What we found is when people, individuals, we took out the estates and families, when individuals inherit artworks, men act different than women. So women, most likely, significantly more, either give or bequeath artworks to museums, while men, significantly more, sell them. Very, resonating with many of the talks we had today. So this is the one finding. Of course, now it starts to get interesting from an art historical perspective. Why is that? Who are it, etc. But we so far managed to analyze it and get out. The other, and I don't ask you to understand this complicated flow or Sankey diagram, but I'm explaining the key insight. What we did here, and it's especially for underrepresented groups or unrepresented groups, which is women, in historical provenance data, what we did is we took the people out of the Art Institute of Chicago 12,000 provenance records. We took these people and mapped it with their equivalents in the ULAN, the Union List of Artist Names, which has really become a provenance name index, and with Wikidata. What we found is that all repositories really benefit from the linking, because the Art Institute of Chicago has details, for example, birth years, that Wikidata doesn't have or that ULAN doesn't have, and vice versa. So linking and using our resources more resourceful matters, even for already relatively well-known people that have been captured in Wikidata, in ULAN, or in provenances, in that case of the Art Institute of Chicago. So I leave it at that and bring the last finding, which Sharon generously mentioned earlier. The more we research, the more we realize we don't know, or in fact, the data, the more we research, the more complex the data becomes. Our data scientist, Fabio Mariani, who wrote his PhD on that, came up with the acronym VISU: vagueness, incompleteness, subjectivity, and uncertainty in art data. VISU is also this with your own eyes. We found, and this is also the analysis of the Art Institute of Chicago data set, 12,000 provenance records amassed to like tens of thousands of provenance events. What we found is that the best researched works in the entire collection, comparing arts of Africa, paintings from Europe, whether in the modern or in the old masters department, have the longest provenances. Not surprising, because of the expansion of the Washington principles and focus on paintings to research them. Have the longest provenances, the most events, but also the most gaps. But they also have the most vagueness. Most events are vague, and they also have the most uncertainties. That means the more you research, and this is also, I think, calling to everyone who writes provenances, don't simplify it. The more you research, the more vague the knowledge becomes. You suddenly know it's near Paris. It's actually not Paris. You suddenly know it's circa 1938. It's not 38. The more events you create, the more half knowledge you have on hand. So this really was something that was also really surprising to me, you actually really see it in the data, how the more research, it becomes more and more detailed. And I think I leave it to that. I'm happy to answer or dig deeper into this. Thank you.
Thank you both. I'm going to ask one very, very detailed question, and then I'm going to hand over to the rest of the audience. So in both of your presentations, which I've really enjoyed, and I think resonate into all the corners of the conversation that we've had so far today, there's a theme which is about knowing who you're talking about. And I think that in the last decade or so, we've seen an incredible development around the infrastructure of linked art, linked open data. But it's still, I think, a very emergent field. And because you're both practitioners in this area, I'd be really interested to hear your thoughts. ULAN, Wikidata, how's it all working? What are the challenges and where should we go with it?
Yeah, well, I can speak a little bit to that. I used to work at the Getty, which is the place where ULAN, so the Union List of Artist Names, which I will also say, yes, it's created at the Getty, but people can propose and add data to it. So it's not, it's meant for the field, by the field. And it's translated into multiple languages by the community. I was surprised to learn when I got to the archives that we didn't rely solely on ULAN, but I think that's also because of the nature of the larger institution. We're part of the Smithsonian. So I'm not in a solely art-driven institution, right? There's a history museum, there's science. And also, it's like a large university. Each unit, it's like a college, right? So it was only recently, actually, when the Women's History Initiative launched, and they said, oh, well, we don't have a collection yet, so why don't we just query across everyone else's collection for things about women, by women, et cetera. And then they came back with these really dismal results because, right, the names of women weren't always clear, right? This need to disambiguate. So now they've been given a pot of money and they've kind of redistributed out for different units to do that. And what they're tending to lean toward is Wikidata, because it is a more quote unquote universal, not discipline specific. And within Wikidata, I can still link back to ULAN. So when we work on disambiguating our names, and because we have, the artist names are fairly well researched, art collectors are well researched, but some of the other people inside a collection that are just getting, passing mention, those are less well researched. And actually what was fantastic, we had a wonderful intern working on this over the summer. She turned up some art dealers that were women that had been, people didn't recognize they were women, or that the firm had actually passed from the name of the father and was in the technical ownership of the daughter. So she actually, I think, for these, we now have a spreadsheet. There's actually more women dealers in our 20th century holdings than male dealers. So, I think that's, that kind of work can really help you change your understanding. I'm not saying that's, that's just a sampling of our records. But anyway, yeah, so that's, I think it's, again, a kind of project that benefits from doing it in community and then trying to pull on the resources that already exist. But then we have to work within our institutional settings too. And you use ULAN and Wikidata, yeah.
We use both, and I would also say, in Germany, for example, it's the GND, which is maintained by the Library of Frankfurt. It kind of doesn't matter which of the repositories you use because they are they are linked across each other. But I feel for all the experts, and most of you are expert on one artist, when where the artist studio was exactly by address, probably from what date to when, and when the artist moved, and at what time the artist was working simultaneously at various studios. If this detailed information would be in one of these repositories, sort of that I sometimes feel like, and this is what we try to do with this like statistic mapping of where ULAN, Wikidata, everyone has different knowledge. And the sad thing with underrepresented people is we keep on researching the same people, but we don't need to research Van Gogh studio addresses. But if you start now with a data project, you probably need to do it because no one has made the effort to put the exact addresses in one of these repositories, let it be ULearn. So I feel starting with the people knowledge and these like addresses and creating one record that is detailed helps going forward for any other data project. I think we are far away from really meaningful linking and analyzing the data across museums, for example, or across collection or catalog raisonnés, because the moment we start as art historians, we realize we really compare apples with pears, with like legacy data that really doesn't hold the standards of data today. We are publishing an article on it, what's called What's in a Name, to see how, and we compare the Gauguin old provenances and the new provenances and how it changed in writing. I mean, thanks to the Wildenstein-Plattner Institute, there's this very detailed, structured, and well-formatted provenances now. This was even possible. So, but it's like still so little data sets that we can actually use. The problem is if we don't engage as a discipline with data, others will do it. Like we see it in the art market reports that are problematic because there's really a handful or there's like 2 people who publish reports that are, and the same will happen, I think, with if you would analyze museum data. It could make easily a headline or catalog raisonné. You could make easily headlines when you write, when you ask questions. Yeah, but the bad faith actors can make easily headlines. So I think people will do it. So I think it's important that we as art historians create data that we can actually rely on and then link to, and to not, to say it as Frank, waste our resources on keep on writing all the same 5 names that the person might have through their life, but like linking it to one and not doing it all over again. So I think this is sort of a...
Completely endorse that. I think we've come such a long way in the last 20 years or so. I think it's obviously it isn't finished yet, but it's a mighty battle. Very good. Can I have any questions from either online or from the audience? A little time. Anyone? Sharon?
Go ahead,
please.
Somebody else's.
There is a question from online. Question for Lynn. Given that provenance research reveals more questions than answers, if you use limited resource to drill down into better known provenances, might that prejudice underrepresented artists where there's no or very little research to date?
Would it still benefit from it? Was that the question? I didn't acoustically.
Might that prejudice underrepresented artists where there's no or very little research to date?
Well, I think adding to this, to implement a digital strategy really shows how little we know, for example, about, for example, female artists. But even the little is already a starting point because you add, I mean, knowledge grows and someone else might have a different aspect. So we see, I didn't go into the details, but in the Art Institute of Chicago, you see an extreme difference between everything that's not created in Europe and outside. Basically, the gap after the creation in everything that's not European, it's always the first provenance event that is unknown. Like basically, how did it get to the West? Or how did it leave the creators, for example, African artists who haven't been recorded? So you see this bias extreme, while in fact in modern art, you have at least a probably bought by Kahnweiler from the artist, and you don't have this. So, and with underrepresented artists, there is this risk of forgery and fakes that was mentioned earlier. It's much easier to bring these works with false provenances on the market. So I think it is all the more important that we actually spend resources on very little research and start with the little we have and have a digital agenda in our mind when we write provenances.
Okay, I think we're Griselda, just quickly, I think we've got a tiny...
Sorry, I'm being a bit too much of a presence. I do apologise. We've talked about this unrepresented and underrepresented and all the rest of it, etc. One of the interesting things about women artists is they were represented. And so when I first started things, all I had to do was to look up Tima Becker. And the thing that I found then is, in case, for instance, of Sophonisba Anguissola, she was so well known at the point at which the old master auctions are happening in the late 19th century and beginning 20th century, that every single Italian or Spanish-looking noblewoman was an Artemisia Gentilis. I mean, was a Sophonisba Anguissola. Now, my interpretation of that information is that the people who were selling and buying at that point knew, right? So I think I keep making this point. They didn't disappear, in a sense, in the time, right? And at the, that's the problem with Anguissola, is you have to sort out what paintings are that, because there are so many, because they were traded. So could you all go away with this? They were not to be discovered, they were not underrepresented, but it's happened in modern art history and its practices. So the auction catalogues of the late 19th century are the really interesting places to track things like that.
Well, please.
Yes, and if I can add to this very much, I also say I use the word omitted, or I also, when I say like uncanny provenance, of like, it is, you see in the provenance writing that this information has been omitted or erased. And this database of European modern exhibitions that was done in Vienna around, what's his name, Raphael Rosenberg, that's where you see the fascinating, like an incredible, as you said, the diverse web of creativity that you see who are exhibited in Eastern Europe. I mean, Eastern Europe has been erased from canon, Scandinavia, and you see all these women and male artists who then don't make it in the provenance, even if they were active as agents also often. So yes, I also talk of omission when I
was going to add, from the archive perspective too, it's sort of an interesting problem. So one way in which many archives are measured by their success is this issue of backlog. So what does that tend to make you do? It tends to make many archives tackle the biggest collections first, right? I'll clear that out. I will do that. Well, whose archives tend to be the biggest? They tend to be these male artists who had these large careers. And so as a project I can take no credit for because it was done before I started, and we nicknamed it Little Women, was actually saying, no, let's go in and look for small archives of women, particularly women artists, and let's start a project to process those. Because yes, we need to tackle that backlog, but in doing that backlog, people who had big careers were constantly at the front of the queue, and the back of the queue were people who had so-called smaller, I wouldn't say even careers, it's just their archival footprint. It's whatever was saved and made its way to us. Because there's lots of things, we were talking about this before, that don't get saved, people who don't make it to a repository. I can tell you an archive that we rescued from the street because of a marriage that was sour and somebody just dumped the material out. So, there's lots of things that just disappear entirely, but we don't want to replicate that disappearance or erasure by putting people to the back of the queue in that processing. So I think that's why we've taken a proactive to let's be mindful of where those small collections are, proactive approach to this critical cataloging, so that we as an archive aren't replicating some of those same ways in which biases appear in the art historical narratives.
I think we're out of time. Are we? All right, go on then.
I'd like to know, how do you collect your oral stories? How are they collected practically, and how it came about?
So one, it came about through this New Deal project. So we were started in 1954, And shortly thereafter, someone said, oh my gosh, all these people that participated in this major visual arts project of the 30s and 40s are of a certain age, shall we say. So age is a factor. We do try to do oral histories. I'm so grateful. We did one with Jean Quick-to-See Smith a year before she passed away. So we do keep in mind sort of age. Again, we look at people who are significant. We've also had a lot of special projects. Shout out to the Keith Haring Foundation, who funded a project for us to do a history on AIDS in art. The Walton Foundation also funded us to do a project on sort of artists of color, LGBTQ plus artists who weren't necessarily being recorded in other ways. So we work through special initiatives. We have an advisory committee that helps to identify, people, or if we find out someone's in a health situation. So again, age, we want somebody who's significant. We also look at the ones who are historically accessed most often to kind of predict, this might be somebody, look, we know this kind of history is referred to quite a bit. So let's make sure that whatever that next generation is of, we will do museum directors, curators. So we try to look at kind of who's been active in the art world. But certainly the list is longer. We try to find an interviewer who will be sympathetic, but we try not to. For example, we don't always use a painter's last studio assistant, because what we discovered is they will sometimes finish the person's thoughts for them. So we want a sympathetic interviewer, and we tell a full life history. So certainly there are other oral histories. You'll see them in museum exhibitions that are about, say, an object that museum owns, but we're trying to tell a full story. And we just let the tape run, so to speak. And that's why they can end up being multiple sessions, 8 to 12 hours. And then we have a long list. So right now, we just finished up an oral history with Mary Kelly. We have funding from the Leon Polk Smith Foundation to do 5 oral histories with Indigenous artists. So again, we look for funding opportunities. We look for people who are at a certain point in their career where it feels like the right moment. So, yeah.
Thank you so much, everybody. We could probably go on for many hours.